So from an agenda perspective, I just wanted to touch on a few things and give some context for this. I'm going to be taking more of a commercial lens here. I do not have a personal research program in rare diseases. I'm not going to be talking about my own wet bench research, but I will be using parts of a case study that was published a few years ago, and I've added to the story. I'll also touch on a bit of what are rare diseases. I think most people are familiar with this, but it gives context from the commercial perspective and how policies and rule books change. I have a business case just to discuss for rare diseases of why, and then a case study on a particular drug that's not specifically and originally developed for rare diseases, but it does have some applications. But nevertheless, the teaching points and the questions and the way to think about it apply across all things. So we're dealing with an intersection of different fields that really have different origins. And so if science is a hummingbird, it moves fast, it responds to things, it zips around, it changes directions. If you looked at law and IP as a dinosaur, it too moves, it moves very well, but it's kind of big. And when it puts its foot down, it's a lot of effort to move things. And sometimes one whacks into the other. And as frustrating as it might be, the hummingbird's going to lose this fight. So you need to be aware of how the rules, how the system works. I won't say rules so much, but how the system really works. And intellectual property sits at a point where business and science and law intersect. From Sarah Lubick's talk from a couple of weeks back referenced these magic people who could walk in both worlds of science and business. This is kind of where they start to hang out. It's got its own rules. Problems from one situation don't get a lot of empathy from the others. And so part of the challenge is juggling all of these. And it will feel a little bit iterative, like you're kind of going around in a circle, keeping the plate spinning. To some extent, that's what you're doing. But some key things that happen are you need money and dates to align. If there's no funding, too bad. IP doesn't care. This is the deadline. If the product you're developing is fantastic science and it's great, but it evolved beyond the scope of the claims that you issued or the patent applications that you filed, your patent protection isn't going to help you here. If you rush out to publish things for something that might work and give all sorts of hints and clues, but you haven't actually reduced it to practice, you could be sacrificing your IP position. You might not get this priority date. And so you need to pay attention to the needs of the other systems. And first of all, you don't have to do it all. You need a team. Second of all, you have to sometimes make choices. The catch is knowing what the choice is and understanding how it works. It's an 80-20 rule. Nothing is perfect. So you do need to plan this. That's why the questions are more important than the answers. And so from your own research perspective today, keep that lens in mind. What do I need to do? How does this apply to me? How would I ask this question? That matters a lot more. So why protect your IP? This is currency. It's to some extent your will worth. It's not the it's not the widget per se, but it's how you use it to increase value, to partner it. And if you sit back and look at the different steps and stages of bringing your widget, your system, your drug to market, you start to see how this works. You don't want to make the leap of going, I file a patent today, let's talk about litigation tomorrow. There's thousands of miles, figuratively, between these things. But you do want to think about how I will use my IP, because ultimately everybody gets to the same place. If you're the black line and your competitors are the red line, you can see on the map, you go straight through. You can step on the publicly available information in the yellow, you can step on the blue and the gray stuff that is your proprietary information, patents, trade secrets, whatever it happens to be. Your competitor has to find a way around these things, but they still get to the end at the end of the day. They may be motivated to speed the process up, at which point now you've got negotiation chips. So this is a real value of IP, is not just the fact that I'm going to file it today and sue somebody tomorrow, but all of the things in the middle that matter and how they work. And this is dynamic and it unfolds over a long period of time. When you talk about your network, and stakeholder and network are very deliberately positioned here, my understanding is most of the audience is based in university and government research labs, varying stage of careers from advanced professorship down to early stage grad students. So you're all going to have slightly different lenses. But you know the university, you know how it works. You know you get government money. This comes from CIHR, various networks, not-for-profits, various things. And if you want to follow the industry path, you start thinking, oh, I could do a startup company. How does this really work? Okay. So that's great. And there's a customer out there somewhere. Somebody's going to buy my thing, sell my product, whatever it happens to be. And so then how do you talk to that particular customer? And who are they really? Everybody says, here's my drug, my customer is the patient. But in Canada, we don't have it quite like that. So it gets more complicated. Oops. But when you're sitting in that startup company at the bottom of a very deep channel looking up, this is what you're seeing. I got to raise money, seed funding, preclinical talks, GLP, regulatory, all these things that this isn't my science anymore. This is stuff that isn't my science. And so really your ecosystem looks a little bit more like this. There's lots of other players and other things motivate them. Yes, the quality of the science has to be there. In fact, that's kind of a given. That's table stakes. It's got to be there. But then what you do with it and how your company approaches this and how you interact with the other people in the system really depends on what that tech is, and it's individual from there. And so again, questions matter. It helps to understand, of course, where your strengths are, but also where the gaps are. Nothing is ever 100%. And I say this because as you are developing therapeutics, even if you're working on them in vitro, and you're still a long way from animal trials, or maybe you're doing your second animal model and you're just on the edge of, filing your IND to be able to start your clinical trial work. Nothing is 100%. And so what the things that aren't 100% are the levers you can pull that can create unique IP positions, that can give you competitive advantage, that can illustrate where you can add value. And so the simple math is here, even if you took this model, for drug development, it's really important to look at it this way because people will talk about it. Oh, and I have, the total accessible market for my disease is some really big number. And so therefore, if I get a really big number per drug and I multiply that by the number of people, there's more money than you can count. In reality, that isn't the case. You're not going to reach everybody. Even the people that you do are still not going to take it up. Who's paying, who's involved. And so all of these things take the relative cut of your market share. And that's okay. Everybody knows this. But don't be blindsided by these questions. And if you've got a way where you can say, no, I can increase my patient reach because I can partner with somebody else, that ups your game and that can make a big difference. So that's the baseline of where we are. That was a pretty generic discussion, and that's great. I want to have a little bit of look at rare diseases. Up until about the mid-'80s or 30-ish years ago, rare diseases were definitely academically interesting, but didn't get the pharmaceutical attention they maybe needed for a variety of reasons. So rare disease land, to use a phrase coined by the CHR, is probably the third or fourth most populous country in the world, if you looked at it that way. You're looking for 200 to 400 million people globally. This is huge. The reason this number varies is it depends a little bit on how any individual country defines rare diseases. But it's an extremely heterogeneous group. You've got in that rare disease land of, say, 200 to 400 million people in a population, you have 6,000 to 7,000 individual principalities. Some diseases have like one or two families that are affected. Others have multiple millions that are affected, and we see them in the news and they're getting a lot of attention. It's incredibly diverse. They've got their own ways of approaching things, population sizes, needs. Even when we look at it amongst our own population, you will see rare diseases are more prevalent in one genetic group than the other. We know this. High unmet need and how to slice it. And a big chunk of them are genetic, so autosomal dominant or recessive. If this is a single gene thing, this opens up doors to a lot of gene therapies, which are a lot of these end, or our approach, which is great. Others are a little more complicated, and there's a still big 20% that's kind of we don't know what it is. We know it's a pathology, but we don't know much more than that. So it's incredibly diverse. You can't talk about one rare disease being like all the others. They're kind of not. To that prevalence question, this is what we see. So the US has defined it in their Orphan Disease Act, which came out in 1983, as being less than 200,000 people are affected by that in the United States. Canada and the United States look at it a slightly different number, and they say there's fewer than 2,000 people affected by it, or 5 in 10,000. But what it comes down to is you see there's different criteria for rare disease. When this starts to reach into the business model, the approachable people, the compensation for it, how companies are remunerated, they get paid, that starts to impact things. And so it does matter how rare diseases are addressed. I'm going to keep the US lens on this today simply because it's the older model and there's more information about it. This is reality. Canada is putting a lot more initiatives forward in rare disease right now. We do have our own definition. To my understanding, we do not have the equivalent of the US Orphan Drug Act, but there are different data protection and other means to extend the exclusivity beyond patent term and stuff like that, or to extend patent term as the case may be. So it devil's in the details, and I don't want to dig into it today. But not every rare disease is as rare as the other ones. These are sort of some of the top 10, just picked by numbers. These are diseases we see in the media. What we also want to notice is some of these are increasing, the incidence of it. So what used to be a rare disease yesterday might not meet the numerical criteria in the future. This now starts to impact your reimbursement, your commercial position, and things like that. So you do want to keep an eye on it. Other times you might develop a therapeutic for something that's not a rare disease, but the therapeutic is very easily usable for a rare disease, and so therefore could take advantage of that. And that does factor into a bit into the Inbrija story. You now have to talk about off-label use, how you would approach that, what is that business position going to look like? And just to point out a few here, primary biliary cholangitis, there is a genetic impact of that. It is rising in its incidence, but the question becomes why? Is it because we can detect it better, or is it actually becoming more prevalent? And these are open questions for some of these and several other ones. Multiple sclerosis, we do know that global distribution is uneven. Canada seems to have more of this per capita than other countries, and there's a lot of debates as to why. Long story short, it's highly variable. And with an aging population, we're going to start seeing these things. So your business case for rare diseases. So by definition, these are small markets, but it clearly doesn't exclude commercialization because we see a lot of these drugs out there every day. Many rare diseases are the focus of science-based businesses, and this is expanding. And just to give some idea of some of the numbers, this is corporate valuation now. It's important to know this is not sales, but they're connected. So your company valuation is usually going to be some fold of your revenue. So when you sell $100 worth of something, the valuation of the company is going to be X times $100, for example. But then what is that? If you are not selling, then your valuation is pendant on the potential for sales. And the closer you get to actual markets, the more de-risking you do, i.e. there's a difference between your initial animal studies versus halfway through phase 3 with really positive results. That's what impacts these things. And you can see some upticks here that are happening. So life goes along. We've started dividing between oncology and non-oncology, and it takes a big jump roundabout in the 2010, 2015 era. What was happening at that time was some of the orphan drug modernization was happening. There was a bit of momentum, and then there was a big uptick in also significant decrease in cost of sequencing. So now all those genetic diseases that you might want to specifically target, there have been a few cases in the past where genetic targets have gone sideways, something integrated in the wrong spot or didn't work. Now that you can get a much more rich understanding of the full genome sequence, you can address that to some effect. There we go. And just to illustrate this, this came from IQVIA, but just showing how human genome started here back in the early 90s. So orphan diseases were a thing back then, and it expands. We now have like the commercialization of consumer-based testing, which is not looking at every disease. Around about 2015, 2016 or so, the costs are going through the floor and they're just dropping and dropping and dropping. And so this becomes a much more accessible way to get the data. When you look at orphan diseases, these are actually incentivized under the Orphan Drug Act. So we're all familiar to some extent with patents. It's a 20-year term from the date of filing to the date of issue. And then when that falls off the table, in come the generics because there's no longer patent protection available. So with rare diseases, you have this extra bonus 7-year exclusivity period that's tied to the FDA approval, which is a really key thing. So you could take 25 years to get your drug to market. But if you are servicing a rare disease, and this is your indicated indication, your designated and so on, you can access this exclusivity period. And this is quite lucrative for some companies that focus on this. Genzyme has a lot of their treatments are rare diseases originally approached that way. And they're very clearly doing quite well in that sense. And it's independent from patent exclusivity. There are other instruments that give you data protection to hold off generics and stuff like that, but this is unique to rare diseases. There's also a priority review process. So rather than just waiting your queue in the FDA to have it taken up, it may get taken up at 15 days instead of 30. Like we saw this with COVID. COVID got a bit of a prioritized review. Orphan drugs can as well. There's tax credits. You may have reduction or waived fees. These are all in the grindy details of some of the orphan drug legislation, but you can Google around and find some of it. I would still suggest go back to primary sources, but there are a lot of financial and economic incentives here. And we see this reflected in the designations and approvals. So if you've got a disease of interest, it's designated as an orphan disease because it's one of those reduced incidence diseases, and that's the blue, the designations, and these started going up quickly as more and more were identified. And then the approvals are in orange, and it's showing that they're going up. They're not as fast as designation because, of course, you're going to designate an orphan disease at your IND stage more than likely. Or very early, not everything gets through regulatory, but the trend is there. There's clearly the interest. Now, orphan drugs are still going to follow the same regulatory path for pharmacokinetics, toxicology, and trials, but they may get further consideration at large trials because of statistical burden. If you do a regular drug for a non-rare disease, I don't want to say common, but a non-rare disease, you could have several thousand people you need to enroll in a phase 3 clinical trial to get through regulatory. If you're in a rare disease, there may not be 1,000 people who have that disease. And so there is some allowance for that. And again, it depends on the individual things. However, there's no rare disease specific IP breaks. It is one set of rules for everybody, whether you're a rare disease, whether you're a common disease, whether you're a mechanical device, whether you're software. If you're playing the patent space, there is one rule book. And it's a bit of a pain, but it's what it is. Occasionally, there will be examination priorities. Like we saw this during COVID. If you had a COVID-related tech, it would be given, or you could ask to have it given prioritized examination at the patent office, and they could do that. Sometimes the rapid examination is actually not what you want from a strategic point of view. So not getting everything now is not necessarily what you want. You do need to think about that. And we know that there's, as you saw in the previous study, there's been trends and changes, and their designations are shifting. So between 1983 and 2019, so this is spanning 25, pushing 30 years or more now, there's been 37, a third in the oncology space alone. Neurology is another big chunk. These are sort of the top 5 designations, and then it starts to trickle out from there from smaller groups. So over 5,000 individual designations and 878 total approvals. That's quite a lot, and you can see that they're coming later. As mentioned earlier, we are seeing the designations shift. Note that oncology is a significant one here because a lot of cancers, because cancer isn't one disease, a lot of them can fall into that category if they're significantly underserved, if there's no really effective treatment, that kind of idea. So you need to be a little creative and understand where the lines are drawn. So from here, I want to step into a case study and illustrate the long-term IP plan and business path that a delivery vehicle, technically, a nanoparticulate delivery vehicle took from concept and filing all the way to actually becoming a drug and becoming part of a drug, as the case may be. Inbrija as a drug is an inhalable levodopa formulation for treatment of Parkinson's disease. This is not a rare disease, but it does show the story that illustrates this planning process, the things that you need to think about at the front end because of how they can bear fruit later on. And it's an illustration of how long things can take sometimes. For a true rare disease, the economic argument and ability to leverage your orphan drug designations, those are going to carry a lot more value in the business case, but they're still there and they're part of the whole story. It's not It's not one or the other or only one thing. So I'm talking to a bunch of people who are well familiar with nanoparticles and such things, so that's great. You understand the conventional drug, your drug of choice, levodopa, for example. You can take that as a pill. It's orally dosed. It's old and known. There may be different dosing interventions, different ways to do it, but long story short, it's the drug. Once you start combining it with other features, some nanoparticulate therapeutic, for example, you're now expanding where you can go. You still have your compound plus formulation. So previously it might have been levodopa plus this salt. Now it's going to be levodopa plus a salt plus a carrier of whatever that happens to be. You're starting to now look at methods that are going to carry much more weight, whether you've got the platform position for just the nanoparticulate carrier in the absence of drug and how it works. You're going to have intellectual property around how you make it. Some of this may stay trade secret. It's your secret sauce. It's controllable. Sometimes you may want to publish these. These are all strategic choices to be made, and everything comes with a price. There can be differences about how you assess PK in a raw plain drug versus nanoparticulate administration because it's starting to go different places or be prevented from going different places. And this is going to impact the story that you tell. And you can build an IP fence around a lot of these different elements. So you have your clear compound, you might have different classes of therapeutics, certain molecules, maybe things are charged or not charged. Maybe they co-package with some agent that enhances function or blocks an unwanted pathway, whatever you need to do. If you were going to try and put two different elements in a single nanoparticulate bubble, you would need to figure out, how do I control the ratios of this? So what are my input mixing ratios versus what comes out the other? And so there's tons and tons of IP in here, but it's not all going to be one particular unit. And so you need to think about what else you're going to need. But to build your own portfolio, you start with this and you plan this. And you may choose to not do things, or you may choose to license or partner up with somebody who has the pieces you need. You don't have to do it all yourself. And then as you go along past the research and into the clinical stage, you may find, okay, we did our studies in our rats and our dog model or whatever your animal models are, and you see certain metabolic or PK trends. Okay, that's great. Then you go into your first in man studies and you realize, oh, we've learned a lot from just going first in human. What story are we telling? How does this work? Well, now we can speak to what are the different clinical stage applications. Maybe you are impacting other biological events in a positive or a negative way. This could be both things. How does that use? Is this a secondary use? Do we have a different way of delivering? Are there particular dosing schedules? And on and on and on. When you get complicated drug products, you have to look at stability and how it holds together, and that opens up a whole new world of IP. So it's not just file my compound and run forward. This is a plan. And this ability to plan and use new and different formulations, it can help you extend your economic lifespan. If you are using a new packaging element, like a lipid or nanoparticle, or in the Inbrija case, the ARCUS technology, you're using that on an old drug. So the old drug's already known, and you can get into the next stage much faster. I don't have to do 10 years of safety on levodopa. We know a lot about it. So you can go from there. And this translates to longer cash flow, sometimes larger cash flow. It opens the door to different licensing things. Again, important to think about it that way when you start adding complexity to your formulation, because that's exactly what you're doing. So the story of Inbrija. This is levodopa, L-dopa, with the ARCUS particulate formulation. Let's catch up on my notes here. I have a couple of comments. The story will go back about 25 years. Traditionally, levodopa is largely orally dosed. It will cross the blood-brain barrier, and then when it gets in there, it gets converted to dopamine, and this modulates the dopaminergic pathway associated with movement. And if you have an imbalance, you get either the uncoordinated dyskinesia, the uncontrollable movements that we see in Parkinson's affected individuals, or if there's too little, you get really stiff and rigid. They're in their off stage of the drug. When you take an oral pill, your blood levels go up and down as part of your pharmacokinetics. And so at a certain point, they're going to drop down below where it's useful to move comfortably. This often happens at night. If you take a dose in the evening, the drug enters the bloodstream no matter how you slice it, and then when you get up in the morning, you're experiencing this this off phase notice. And Inbrija is indicated for these episodes in Parkinson's patients as an inhalable agent, because when you inhale the drug, it goes quickly into the bloodstream and can quickly act to correct that dopamine imbalance. And so it's got that advantage of sort of filling in the cracks and the gaps where your blood dose is going up and down, but it's not your primary dose. And as I said, Parkinson's is not a rare disease, but there could be subtypes that may fit into there. So if this touches on your research, have a good look at the details. Maybe it is a rare disease after all. And there is a known rare disease called Sagawa syndrome, which is a dopamine responsive dystonia, and it is a rare disease. As far as I know, it is not indicated for Inbrija, but maybe it could be, or maybe there's an off-label use. This is a little bit more homework that I would need to dig into. And Arcus itself, as a dry powder system, actually has indications or demonstrated for a number of different actives that you could use it for. Advance the slide. So this is the timeline we're talking about. So back in 1996, the priority patent filing happened for the Arcus drug formulation, the polymers that did their job. And key publications came out of this. There was a company called Advanced Inhalation Research that spun out of MIT, founded on this particular technology to bring it to market. And they started filing more patents, doing more R&D, and things like that. Alkermes, another big pharma, acquired Air. And Alkermes had done some phase 1 studies on an inhalable epinephrine formulation. They had also partnered up with Lilly for an inhalable insulin formulation. And this terminated in 2008. That could have had as much to do with economic reasons as anything else. You could probably dig into some of the public filing of Alkermes and or Lilly and figure that out, which is another really useful place to look for how drugs are developed and where the information is. Public SEC filings are chock full of very interesting data. So once the Lilly agreement fell apart, Alkermes spun out a company called Civitas, and this was the Arcus manufacturing capacity. So it's not enough just to have the IP, you actually have to build this stuff, and it's pretty specialized. So they built the facility, and they did a phase 1 on inhalable levodopa, which was then CVT-301. That's the name of that. 2014, Civitas was acquired by Accorda, who now holds the levodopa, or the Inbrija. They did their phase 1, their phase 2. Submission to the FDA, they got their approval in very late 2018, and they listed the Orange Book in 2019. This is also a useful place to look when you're doing your homework. Is the Orange Book is an American document that basically lists all the active patents associated with any given drug. And so you can go in there and find out what's alive. And it's a great first place to look if you know the name of the compound. And then you can start working the story backwards. And so it can help you illustrate what's actually happening. And now, after 2019, Inbrija is on the market, and it's pulling down somewhere in the 25 to 30-ish $1 million US per year. And it is expanding into Europe. I believe it's now available in Canada, maybe under special license, I'm not sure. But long story short, this is the storyline you're dealing with, and it rolls out over 25 years. It's also a really big patent family. And I put this up here because it does look like some kind of disjointed octopus. But it's showing you the different ways you can leverage your family. Key things to look at when we go back in time, this was originally filed in 1996. Some of the laws in the states and guidelines on patent practice are a little different now. This uses extensive continuation practice and divisionals. It also uses some continuations in part with just other different IP instruments. But long story short, the company and the licensees use this to be able to keep the portfolio rolling out, keep something alive, to address more information as they were able to speak to it, and different ways to sort of define their particular composition, forming a little bit of a ring structure, a patchwork, because nothing is perfect. But if you have a bunch of overlapping patchwork quilts, all of a sudden you have a blanket. And so this is a good way to think about your technology. It is very clearly not one and done. Your IP strategy is going to roll out over years. US is unique because they get this messy. But we do see expanded families in Europe and Canada and other places too. But the US is particularly juicy for this. The documents tagged by the green stars are just the ones I'm going to look at the specific claims next. So for the patent wonks out there in the audience, this is for you. But it also speaks to the science, because if you're up to your elbows in these kind of formulation or carrier development work, you're going to recognize some of these ways to very finely define things. So we'll look at one of the first ones here, and this is in the Arcus family as it was originally filed. This is that first patent, and it talks about a particulate composition. They need to be biodegradable, suitable for delivery to the deep lung. That's the magic of these things, is they're polymers, but they're extremely lightweight and fluffy. And so when you inhale them, they go deep, deep, deep into the lungs, so they can be quickly release the drug and absorbed in the bloodstream. But they're too large to be eaten by the macrophages that are running all around cleaning up all the dust and crap that we would otherwise breathe in. So they were, when they manufacture them with a lot of secret sauce around the methods, how to get that consistent size, mass, 90% of the particles have a mass mean diameter of a particular dimension. They have a density below a certain cutoff, and this is so that they can go into the lungs deeply, but they have to be big enough to not cause the problem. And so it's tuned very carefully. And then the agent is absorbed into the blood, or sorry, onto the particles as a carrier. So I would put the open question to you saying, is this a broad claim or a narrow claim? How can you tell? And is that good or bad? And this is a loaded question. Not everybody talks about wanting to get broad claims, but really if they're too broad, they're going to fall apart. This is very focused to what the polymers did. Look in the next family. They're still talking about particulate compositions, but now they've added a surfactant. So it's a little more focused. It needs another unit. It's still talking about just the particle now. It's not talking about sticking any drug to the particle like the previous one did. So this is any particle that meets these criteria. We now have biocompatible particles for delivery. And there's a key word in there about comprising a therapeutic. So we're still maintaining the density cutoff and the size, but we've narrowed down what else needs to be in there. And so if you think about it, these are all just different ways to slice up the pie. The data taught in the original patent application and carried through that very large family had data on biocompatibility. It had data on the tap density. How do you formulate them to have that density? It had information and data on how to size these. It had information on the geometric dimensions of these particles and all these other adjectives. That information had to be in the original filing. You can't keep adding it later. So you did need to address that. And when you're planning your research and you're thinking about how am I going to envision this being a company, these are some of the things you need to look at the front end, because you can't go backwards, unfortunately. This is one of getting to the end of the story here. There's a lot of variability in these. Now these are just particles. Same patent application, same family, same original disclosure, but they're not biocompatible, they're just particles. And now they're talking about the particles have a therapeutic agent, and they have something that is selected from a group, which could be a surfactant, or it can have a charge, and then it forms a, you don't have to have a surfactant. So you've got some different variability in here. Again, tap densities there. A respirable fraction of at least 10%. So now they've actually gotten very specific about a particular machine and system used to measure these things. And this is tied to your delivery puffer. And if you grind into the engineering details of those, you can see that they have to meet certain minimal criteria, not too much, not too little. How is this quantified, and all this sort of idea. And these are things you want to think about, not just here's my drug, here's my particulate formulation, but how am I going to give this to somebody? How do I know I'm getting the right dose? And back to that earlier slide about that 80% cutoff, 100% of anything doesn't get in the system. So how much needs to be packaged to be able to be delivered? How do I test that? These are all the questions that really start digging into specific experiments that can add huge amounts of value when you can add them, when you can address them. I won't say answer, but address them. And now we're getting into a method. So everything up to here was all about compositions, particles, things. Those are very important because they're practiced in public. You can go and buy a product that you think might have those particles, and you can examine it. And so if somebody's going to, behave offside, you can actually test it out, because they would need permission to have that composition. But when you get to methods, a lot of methods can happen in a black box. We'll see methods of formulating a thing comprising these steps. Most manufacturing activities take place behind locked doors. They're in a black box. You can't see what's happening. Now, this method is a little different because this is a method for delivery via the pulmonary system. So you would still see a third party practicing this claim if they were selling an inhalable puffer-based drug of some sort. And they're using wording in here that might not get through these days. And so you want to think about it. But if you saw administering to the respiratory tract an effective amount of particles or an effective amount of drug, it begs the question of how much is an effective amount. And if you can demonstrate there's a range of effective amounts from, 50 grams to 100 grams or whatever it is, then that's probably good. But if you've got zero data on what could be an effective amount, you're going to have a tough time getting that language. And so again, experiments to do at the front end, things to think about. Maybe some of these are just controls you put into early experiments. And now we're getting very specific about the lipids involved. So that was the ARCUS carrier system. And as is per the earlier slide, this technology and system had been transferred through a few different pharmaceuticals. And now we're dealing with Accorda, who purchased or acquired it all and then took it into market. But some of the original pulmonary delivery for levodopa, the Inbrija formulation as it ended up, did actually start with a startup company at the beginning. But if you look at the original AIR patent family, the word levodopa or L-dopa or even particular drugs don't even show up in there. They kept the disclosure to the particles themselves. And they might have used a few little test things, but they weren't looking at L-dopa or levodopa. The use of these particles with levodopa specific claims came a little later. And in this case, this is the timeline. We'll have a look at a couple of the key patents. You can see that it started very early, back in 2002, but there was a long delay in there before anything got issued. Now, if somebody's truly interested, there are ways you can go back to the record and you can see what kind of arguments and how long it took. I suspect there was a lot of back and forth to get some of these things issued. But then the family carries on. And so some of these actually have rights that will go out as far as 2030. So even though the original ARCUS particulate support is off patent now, the drug containing it is still going forward. And so just as a couple of examples of how things came later, we're now saying a method of treating a patient with Parkinson's disease. That's really particular, comprising administering to the respiratory tract, levodopa. It's telling you what's specifically in that carrier and the particles being delivered there. And within the body of that patent application, well, now issued, it will talk about the methods, the puffers, how these things work and what they do. There is composition in there. Of dry powder consisting of levodopa and other things. And it's giving you some really particular ratios, 90 to 8 to 2. This is the drug. So this claim has a lot of weight because that's what's actually being administered. That's your composition. The method of treating a patient, that's not manufacturing. That's you're going to see how that is done. So even if you can't get a composition on the material, you can get method patents, but they're still only related to that. This is tied to Parkinson's disease. So earlier I said that Sagawa syndrome was another dopamine-related disorder that is also treated by administering levodopa. So if somebody wanted to do off-label use and treat Sagawa syndrome with Inbrija, the first claim from the 8 million series patent would just roll off their back like water off a duck. But the 9 million series might capture them because now it does not specify what disease it's being used for. So you have to think about how the puzzle pieces will fit together. I'm just about at the end because I know I'm coming up to question time here. So I wanted to put out there some key take-home messages from all of this. I'm hoping people have lots of questions and open-ended gee what ifs and stuff in their notes, because all of this was not about the specific story, but how you think about the problem. You want to have a plan and you want to have backups to your plans. Some of the early filings were chemistry only, sure. But the potential for them to evolve into other things was definitely being contemplated. Had to have been thinking about at that point. And you separate something in time, the ability to do the experiment versus publish the experiment. And you need to manage that when you're in an academic environment with the need to publish and address your academic obligations. And so sometimes you have to think about it, it's like, ooh, is this actually the focus of my PhD or is this a side thing? Because I still have to fulfill all my publication obligations in my thesis. And so it's a planning exercise for discussion. Most things are not binary answers, with the exception of if you publish it, you're going to kind of mess up some of your ability to get patents around the world later on. You want to separate what goes on in the company for this reason, because they have really different obligations. This is not to say they're mutually exclusive. You just need to be aware of the different pressures. And that goes back to that Venn diagram and those magical people walking in both worlds. They're looking in two different directions. If you thought of them as a chameleon, their eyeballs are going differently. Focused for your early applications, not narrow, but focused. You have to be aware of what else is out there, third-party stuff, and figure out the relevant position that matches what you have, your product market fit. You can't know enough about what came before you. And if you know about something, you can deal with it and you can prepare for it. The dangerous stuff comes is when you get blindsided and you don't have time to build a plan or you didn't know it was there. So all of that, staying on top of the literature, monitoring what other people are doing, is all critical for your competitive intelligence. With that, I will say thank you very much. I did cover a lot of ground today. More than happy to have follow-on discussions and take questions.
Cynthia, there was a lot of really valuable information here and clearly a ton of experience behind your presentation today. And I might ask you to bring your slide deck back up just so we can focus on a few slides.
Sure.
First, I just have a very quick question, which probably illustrates my lack of expertise in this area. On a slide, you had the value of the rare disease sector, and you said the top 31 rare diseases and the pure play are in rare disease therapeutic companies. What did you mean by that, the pure play?
So the pure play definition, that's companies that are just doing rare diseases. This comes out of a Torreya report on global pharmaceuticals. That's where the numbers came from. But when they talk about pure play rare disease therapeutic companies, they were referring to the ones who did just that. Or in some cases, if you could tease out the valuation of it. There was, round about that time, I think there was an acquisition. Sanofi had acquired a rare disease company. I want to say Genzyme, but I don't trust my memory right now. And so it was incorporating some of that as well. But that's what they're talking about, not somebody with an extensive, multifaceted pharmaceutical program where it's really hard to tease out the individuals.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And Terry Allen has a question, and Terry is the chair of NMIN's Research Management Committee. So Dr. Allen, take it away.
So Diane, as you know, we've discussed this before at one of our, actually at the last meeting in Toronto, and that is sources of money to develop therapies for rare diseases. And I wonder if Cynthia might have some additional thoughts on that, because you know, drug development and doing the clinical trials and everything is extremely expensive. I mean, now it's getting up into the hundreds of millions of dollars or even the billions of dollars. And so when you have a very small population and our genetic research is going to lead to all kinds of interesting new cures and treatments for rare diseases. But the populations will, as you know, often be quite small, and the ability to get the money to actually develop for these therapies for very small populations, to me, seems to be one of the real challenges.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Terry. Getting the money is always the challenge. Rare disease, common disease, any of it. What might help to sort of think about it is, for lack of a better description, different colors of money. So if you're doing the academic early stage research, that's a different color of money with different sources and different expectations than when you're going into industry. Again, and different things like that. So from an industry perspective, there are, the Orphan Drug Act in the States, there's an equivalent one in Europe. Canada has some definition of rare disease, but I don't believe we have something that gives the specific tax breaks and the protection incentives that they do in the Orphan Drug Act in the States. So we don't have that yet, but the acknowledgement is there. More recently, there is federally a push on rare diseases to open this dialogue and raise exactly this question. And there is an interest in it, but there's also going to be a different motivation as to whether you're talking about a single family disease, of which there are a lot of rare diseases, versus some that are not quite so rare. And that's going to color that economic discussion. When you're in an academic space, rare diseases are great for understanding a lot of biology. They're very valuable in that regard. And the potential of real immediate human benefit, particularly with a lot of the genetic technologies we have now, the mRNA-based things for liposomal delivery, that can help a lot. It can accelerate that process. Unfortunately, it doesn't slow it down. But in terms of specific money sources, this is going to be a moving target. In Canada, I would say definitely keep an eye on CHR, because I have seen resources go through there. There may be specific patient advocacy groups who may have an impact in there. And also look outside of Canada. There may be other instruments, other higher incidences of a disease in certain populations than there are in Canada. And maybe that's a place to look, because research expertise is global now. Science crosses all borders. And maybe Germany has a particular patient advocacy group with a lot of resources, for example, that fit with the particular disease your research program is on, and you go from there.
Yeah, well, I don't need to remind you that as long as we're in the research stage, or even maybe in the very early adaptation phase, we're not getting into the serious money. But there is some very serious money that you end up getting into the minute you start getting into clinical trials and drug approvals. Yes. And things like that.
Yep.
And so the not so serious money, I'm not worried about us finding those amounts, and up to $1 million, a couple of $1 million.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars that you may need to go on from there. That seems to me is going to be a problem.
It is. And just from a company perspective, that's going to come out of usually access to that, not just the money itself, but the network and the connectivity comes from the licensing and the partnerships with larger pharma, the Alkermes, the Lilly's, the whoever they are. In order to sweeten that pot and to make that a competitive thing, at the end of the day, are for-profit industries, and they have to be able to speak to that. But as I wanted to try and illustrate here, and I hope I did to some extent, is that even the very early stages of the research can set the platform stage to be able to have that conversation later when you're talking about it. But you're right, you're absolutely correct. Getting into clinical trials, there's no deals. There's no cheap way around it. You're still going to have to, demonstrate the efficacy and things like that.
So do you see that there are big pharma who, of course, have their stockholders to justify these expenses for doing a lot of development of things that are not going to end up bringing any profit and are basically going to cost the company money without bringing in the kind of money that will cover the sales? So where do we go with that?
So a difficult question, and I can't speak for any one company, but you could look back at the Alkermes stage, just using the Inbrija model. They were able to show that their carrier worked for a bunch of different things. Now, why Lilly dropped that at phase 3, I don't know. But if you're working with a carrier platform that, could carry anything, for example, that does speak to a lot of value. And maybe the big pharma is interested not so much in that drug, that disease, but their interest may come from the carrier platform itself. And the rare disease is a path to getting that research and showing how it works. So there's value at looking at it both ways. An advantage to a rare disease, of course, is if there is no treatment, then your standard of care is basically palliative and management. And so any drug, the first drug, will have an easier path. If you're pursuing a very well-served market, heart disease, Lipitor, that kind of idea, any drug you bring to market, no matter how wonderful it is always comparable to standard of care. So a rare disease can sometimes be a way of demonstrating techniques and platforms as well.
Thank you very much. Amazing information. I was wondering, so is there a criteria to make a disease rare based on like Health Canada or FDA or other health authorities?
Yeah, they define it by incidence in the population. So the Orphan Drug Act in the United States, they define it as being less than 200,000 cases in the United States population. In Canada, or sorry, in Europe and Canada, Canada follows the European definition in that, and it's basically 1 in 2,000 people. So the different countries define it slightly differently.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends on total incidence. There is an orphan, is it NORD? I'm going to forget all the acronyms now because I'm trying to think of them, but there are a few different incidences that will list what is a rare disease and what is not. Orphanet is a European resource that has a lot of data on these sorts of things. But the only way is to just start looking into the particular disease of interest that you have, and then compare and have a look at what is the actual incidence. Is there subtypes to the disease? And this is an open question. If there's 3 different subtypes and they're actually all really different, but kind of gets lumped under the same name, possibly the subtypes could be considered rare diseases. But there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,000 to 7,000 of these. So I don't want to try and guess in that regard. What's a rare disease in one country might not be in the other as well. And this also impacts reimbursement and who pays for pharmaceutical costs and stuff like that.
Pharmaceutical.
Thank you for that question.
Thank you very
Ellie.
much.
Marshall,
No
next question.
Thank you. The next question has been submitted in writing. I'll read it out. The question is, how broad should methods patents for use of a drug for a specific rare disease be? Same scope as for an FDA orphan designation or broader?
Oh, wow. So it's a good question. It comes up all the time. Asking how broad a patent should be is kind of like asking how long a piece of string should be. Long enough to do the job. The trends in the patent office, as they've evolved over the last 20 plus years, are examiners want more and more specificity generally. So if you look at stuff that issued 20 years ago, some of the claims we were looking at, these are pretty broad. These are pretty loose. They have some definite constraints, but you wouldn't likely get a claim on a particulate composition comprising phosphatidylcholine. That's way too broad. You might start carving it down into units and adding some details. But if you've got a brand new composition of matter, like an actual brand new chemical entity, that's some fancy new lipid that nobody's seen before and nobody's taught, and you can get a patent claim issued to that lipid, then all you just say is a protein composition comprising that molecule, bang. And then it's completely disconnected from what anybody might do with it. So if they want to put it in a sandwich filling or in a drug or whatever, you've got a composition of matter describing that specific molecule. So it can be incredibly broad and powerful to having that kind of protection. When you start piling things together and you deal with the teachings in the art, it forces you to focus more. There's always a tension to want to be as broad as you can, but in reality, it can be often, if you stretch the balloon too far, it becomes easier to poke a hole in it. That's the best analogy I can come up with. So you want to be focused on what are you doing with this and where do you want to go? And when you look at patent claims, they're often constructed like onions. It's not just one claim, there's like 20 of them. And here's the outer layer and the inner and the inner and the inner and the inner, and you get more and more focused until you're down to that little green nub in the middle of the onion. That is exactly the molecule, the dose, the ratio, with wearing red socks on a Tuesday. And you want to think about it that way. Not what the broadest thing is, but what are my narrowest things going to be?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Cynthia. I think if we're brief, we have time for one more question before we wrap up today. So Marshall, the question?
From Sarah Thompson, she wrote, "Thank you for such an informative talk. You mentioned that rapid patent examination may not always be better. Could you please elaborate on this?"
Sure, no problem. Thanks, Sarah. It's a good question. It also comes up a lot. So you only have a certain amount of control over how fast patents go through the system. And when you file, once you file your first priority document, you start a clock ticking. and you can't control it any longer. So there are very fixed dates that are going to come up for next stages and things and so on and so forth. When you're a startup company and you're very early stage, or even if you're still an academic concept that's not quite a company yet, you still have to get things filed early because you have to publish papers and do all of that. But you might not know enough about your business position, or you might not know where is your market actually going to be, because there's 200 sovereign nations on earth and you can't file everywhere. Sometimes you don't want to commit to certain claim scopes. Maybe you want to wait and see how the data works or which direction things go in. And so by not rushing prosecution, because you can accelerate it, but by choosing to not accelerate it, you buy yourself time to get money, time to make decisions, time to choose markets. If there is a business case for why you want to accelerate it, then you can do that. But once you get your claims issued, you've committed to those words and you can't go back later without incurring significant expense. And so sometimes you're better off to delay if you can, because the art will advance, people will learn more, publications come out, all sorts of things that can impact you. And when you do patent examination, it's never perfect. So there's some regions who they do better searches than others. They look in different places or they look different ways. And you want to be able to accommodate that in your decision-making process. And so time is very often your friend.
Excellent. Thank you very much.